Hello. I'm going to be doing chapter 10 by Skinner on the inner world of motivation and emotion. So in contrast to previous Skinner chapters on intellect and analytical things, this chapter is more so devoted to emotions and instincts, wants, needs, drives, things like that. So to reference that, we're going to be using the term psyche as opposed to the intellect of the brain. So Skinner quickly sums it up by saying that the psyche and intellect are not unrelated to one another, and that sometimes the psyche can be fulfilled by the intellect, though it's usually through external actions. So the first part is on personalities, and he says someone's individual personality is primarily a collection of personal experiences and behaviors. His example is of a boy learning how to behave around his family versus how to behave in the military. So he, as one individual, can contain both of those separate behaviors as they together attribute to his personality. Most learned behaviors like this can live in harmony, but occasionally they will conflict. And this is where a lot of behavioral issues arise. Skinner says, and I quote, "What a person is really like could mean what he would have been like if we could have seen him before his behavior was subjected to the action of an environment. We should then have known his human nature." So this isn't really a question for you all so much as asking for examples. I really liked this quote, and I would love to see you all come up with an example of this situation, one where external experiences impact a person's behavior. So continuing with the personalities, we are referenced to Freud and his famous ego, superego, and id. He claims when humans are in a group that these three personality types almost always appear. So for quick summation, id represents instincts and more primal needs. Ego is the practical part of the mind that dedicates itself to fairness and self-control. And the superego is the part with a higher moral compass and desire to do right. So when he said that, I wasn't really sure, it was kind of confusing if he meant that within each of us we have the three of those, or if in a group one of those traits will dominate each individual person and they'll be more apparent. Maybe both. I'm not sure. If you know, you should comment that down below. So Skinner agrees with this, but he does point out that these are maybe less universal than Freud initially thought, because what one culture might find to be an id could be a superego in another culture. His example is of a son loving his mother and viewing his father as a rival. Some cultures find this incredibly natural and empowering and very masculine, and other cultures would find this really weird and bizarre and not good. So the next section is on life in the psyche, and they start by discussing the term schizophrenia, which originally referred to split mind. What I got from that was like when someone has two minds, to be of two minds about something, where they have two opinions, is what it was initially meant to address. So when we refer to schizophrenia today, it's not in the original sense. In our minds, we have our conscious and our unconscious. Sometimes our thoughts in the unconscious appear in our conscious. And everyone knows how much Freud loves that. So of course he's going to come back in this. And then Skinner points out that behaviorism specifically is used on the unconscious. He goes on to mention something called the intrapsychic life of the mind, which exists only in the mind. It was a bit confusing to follow, but it seemed to me to be like a chain of events. So one memory triggers another memory and so on. And one of the examples he gives is how weakened faith in the future can lead to anxiety and depression, which in turn disrupt your thought process, which is something that I deal with on a weekly basis. So that made a little bit of sense to me. How one thought can trigger another, and then affect how you can process just general thoughts. So the next part is my favorite part in the chapter because it made the most sense, honestly. I was the least confused. This is on Freud's defense mechanisms. And in it, Skinner discusses the three major devices that Freud came up with called repression, conversion, and sublimation. And they are all used to lessen negative impacts on our psyche, like anxiety and guilt and sadness. So repression is exactly what it sounds like. When we take our anger or sadness and hold it inside until it bursts out, that's repression. It usually comes out in some sort of aggressive behavior. Oftentimes people who repress their feelings are the ones who were punished for expressing themselves before. So Skinner points out that instead of punishing children for expressing anger, we should instead give them alternative means of communicating their feelings, maybe through talking or toys, or heck, maybe scream into a pillow. Sometimes I do that. It's great. It's a great time. The next one is conversion, which is when our inner conflicts manifest into actual physical symptoms. This could be something like an ulcer or another ailment. I imagine it would be even worse in someone with severe anxiety. And I think I've read somewhere before with Freud, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that they used to refer to this as hysteria. I think that was one of the physical manifestations, but they just didn't understand what it was, why it was happening. The last mechanism is sublimation, and is probably the best one for anyone to do. This is when you take negative emotions and turn them into positive behavior. So if you're fuming mad, you could go paint a picture of a bird, or you can make a lasagna or something great like that. I don't know, but do something else that's more productive and beneficial. The next section on inner causes is really long. So here's my best synopsis of what happens. Oftentimes we don't know why we are experiencing an emotion. When we see others, we can only base what we know about them on their actions or words, but that doesn't give us any insight into what their thought process really is in making those choices, if that made sense. So a good example is politicians. What makes them support one group? Why do they want to pass this law and not this law? We don't know everything that has led up to that decision, and it's impossible to fully ever know in this moment in time. And the mind has several layers, just like the earth does, and it's just as bumpy. And aside from having the best name in history, this guy Erik Erikson said that we have 8 psychosocial stages of ego. And to get to the root of anyone's traits takes a lot of energy because there's so many levels. There's 8. The rest of the chapter focuses on why we should investigate further into inner causes. And it cautions us to not assume someone behaves in a certain way because they were reinforced to do so. I'll be honest, this entire section starts to get a little muddy and confusing. There's so many examples and analogies, so I totally follow it, but toward the end he does explain that when we assume and put labels on other people's behavior, we are often overlooking the true cause, and more often than not, that cause is reinforcing yourself. If you can explain that further, please explain that further, because I don't totally understand that. I got the gist of it. And the last part is the uselessness of inner causes. Skinner admits that the psyche and the mind are all just metaphors used to help us to try and understand what is happening in ourselves and others, since it is not a physical object that we can look at or observe. And there's no one particular answer that we're trying to find, and any information will do, and we'll take whatever we can to learn about the mind. And that's how he ends this. So my discussion questions, along with the one I mentioned toward the beginning, are: have you used the 3 main defense mechanisms, and is there one that you use more than others? And the second one is either drawing from experience or maybe observing in the next few days. Can you easily pinpoint other people's id, ego, and superego, and how? All right, that is 10 minutes of me talking at you. I can't wait to see what you guys post and talk with you guys this week. All right, bye everybody.